everyone, and hi, everyone online. My name is Tracy Potts. I'm the Executive Director of the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College. This is our Washington office, and I am here to welcome you to our space and welcome you to this conversation tonight. It's actually a conversation I've very much been looking forward to, approaches to faith in public life. As a leader, I've done both. I have been a person of faith in my private life and shared a very public life as well. I am excited to have our speakers tonight. As journalists, I spent 30 years of my life as a broadcast journalist, and so these kinds of conversations excite me and energize me. And I think it's really important for us to think about the importance of faith. It's often something that we don't talk about, but it's such a very important undercurrent of some of the politics and some of the polarization, a lot of the polarization that we're seeing, not only in our country, but our world. And so with that, welcome. I look forward to everyone getting involved in the conversation this evening, and I will turn it over to my colleagues and co-hosts with the International Center for Religion and Democracy. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Tracy, for your warm welcome. My name is Ray Kim, the Director of U.S. Programs and Partnerships here at ICRD. Thrilled to have you, and I too, like Tracy, have been really looking forward to this conversation. This is part 2 of our 3-part panel series. So for repeat audience members, welcome back. Thanks for coming back. For new faces, good to have you. Hope to see you on the last one as well, coming up in June. Yeah, just to kind of echo some points that Tracy has already made, I think this is a very interesting topic and one that's really timely and relevant. I think, in my personal opinion, it does get a lot of attention, but usually the conversations are quite flat, maybe one-dimensional. So I'm really excited to see how our panelists today kind of bring depth to this really complex topic. Usually we see this debate around the proper place of religion in politics, in our public spheres of life, but often overlooking the complexities of the values that individuals bring to that space, whether or not we can even just kind of bracket those things and just kind of leave it hanging at the door before we step into certain spaces, how even appropriate that may be. So yeah, I'm really excited to see where our conversation goes today, moderated by Luke Phillips here on my left. And for those who are here today, thank you so much for your time and attention. We are going to take your time and attention as a sign that this is the kinds of events that generate a lot of interest. For those who are joining online, thank you as well. We are tracking attendance online as well. But without even just your attendance and your time, I think the financial support that we've gotten through philanthropic donors like the M.G. Murdoch Charitable Trust, but also individuals such as yourselves have made this event possible. And so if you feel so inclined to pay it forward for the next cohort of audience members to come and enjoy something like this free of charge, please do so. You can go to our website at icrd.org, and then you can kind of go into the gift or giving tab, and then you can denote what this is for, what your gift would be for. So thank you again, and I will turn it over to Luke.
Thank you, everybody, for being here with us in person, and thank you, Tracy and Ray and the Eisenhower Institute and ICRD for making this possible. And all of our friends tuning in from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, the Gettysburg College, and the Wisdom of Crowds communities. I'm grateful that you all are interested in this conversation, and we will see where we can go. So let me just outline what we will be thinking about today, and then we will go and start from there. Many have argued for decades that we live in a postmodern secular age when the sacred in public life is on a long retreat and when spirituality has withered down to the interior lives of individuals. Yet this apparently boring and anti-numinous end of history has been rocked since it began by groundswells of ideological, religious, and otherwise revivalist sentiment from all corners of the political spectrum. One need only look around the public discourse now, and the relevance of recent books on religion by people like Ross Douthat and Jonathan Rausch, friends of ours, the success of magazines like Comment, and the raucous discourses on the internet of far less sophisticated understandings of the sacred. There is far more religious discourse right now than one would ever expect in a secular age. So what are the defining lines of religious life in our secular age? we see the classic divides of theologically traditionalist and theologically modernizing denominations inside religious groups, from Catholicism to Judaism to the various Protestant denominations, and especially in Protestantism across the evangelical and mainline divide. There are ideas of a religious right and of Christian nationalism and of interfaith coalitions that tend, for the most part, to split across predictably red and blue lines. Less specifically, thinkers like these ones on stage have observed trends of traditionalist revivalism and of a sort of theologically light but spiritually deep self-help in different parts of American society. The role of growing religious minorities, especially Muslims and Mormons, is changing as well in politically interesting ways. And then, of course, there's a question of functional religion and civil religion. We all have a friend here named Tara Isabella Burton, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, but we will get her someday, who has extensively documented and theorized on strange and mundane things like fandom and astrology and a place on the internet called the manosphere, filling spiritual needs in an increasingly complicated and fragmented world in very dangerous ways, shaping the personal spiritualities of the incels and the Zoomers raised in the age of the internet. And to extend this to a public extreme, there are those who have argued that wokeness is a messianic spiritual movement and that MAGA is a charismatic revivalist movement. So are these real religious movements or are they not? Are explicitly political movements with deep spiritual roots a part of American religious life, or are they just part of political life? And is the old flag religion of presidential inaugural addresses and military rituals alive anywhere outside of official life, or is it dead as a concept that is real to Americans? Is there any prospect of a fundamentally unifying religious tendency amid all this? I am personally biased for the idea that modern secularity, far from being just a boring time, is actually a time that is speckled with incredible religious diversity and religious creativity in a transformative sense. But this is not the only way to think of it. And whether it is the right way to look at it or not, what it means for analysis and action is very much up for debate. So, to help us to think through these themes and others and their implications, we are graciously joined by two very thoughtful thinkers and practitioners in the American religious discourse. Shadi Hamid is the co-founder and co-host of the Wisdom of Crowds podcast and newsletter and community, and one of the most interesting and well-curated philosophical intellectual projects in the Washington, D.C. area. He is a professor of Islamic studies at the Fuller Theological Seminary and a columnist at the Washington Post, where he routinely comments on cultural, political, and even spiritual issues. His book, Islamic Exceptionalism: How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, was published in 2017. Christine Emba is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and has been a staff writer at The Atlantic, a columnist at the Washington Post, and currently is a contributing writer at the New York Times, where she also routinely comments on cultural and political and spiritual issues. She is a visiting fellow at the Center for Economy and Society at the Johns Hopkins University, and her book, Rethinking Sex, a Provocation, was published in 2022. These two are on the Wisdom of Crowds podcast together quite a lot, and I am always happy and excited and honored to bring a little corner of the internet to the IRL world, as we kids are calling it these days. My name is Luke Nathan Phillips, and I work with ICRD on political polarization and its various manifestations, including the crises of social trust, polarization, and the role of religion in modern America. I have spent my career doing polarization studies and reconciliation work and obsessing over the nature of American political ideology, which, as I hope we can demonstrate tonight, is intricately related to America's spiritual and religious life. This conversation is first and foremost an exploration of some of the best approaches to religion and religious themes in the contemporary political and cultural discourse and their relations to our public life more broadly. If by the end of this conversation we have glimpsed some of the outlines of a framework for thinking about the American religious landscape, including red-blue polarization and American political sociology, and opened paths to further inquiry, we will have succeeded. So with that, Shadi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luke. Thanks to the Eisenhower Institute and ICRD for hosting us. So yeah, let's get right into it. I'll start with something that's maybe a little bit obvious to all of you, but it's worth repeating and at least being very, very consciously aware of, which is that over the past 2.5 decades, there's been a precipitous decline in religious attendance and religious observance. From about 1937 until the year 2000, church attendance was hovering at around 70 to 75%. It then fell under 50% for the first time in 2021. That decline has stabilized somewhat over the past 2 years, but the downward trend seems like it will be with us for some time to come, largely because the younger generations tend to be the least religiously identifying, and the oldest generations tend to be the most religiously identifying. So of course, when older generations pass and the younger generations grow older, we'll see a continuing decline in some of these numbers. At least that's the case if the trends continue as they've been. Now, my view on this is that this is largely bad news. And I think that it's somewhat intuitive why it's bad news, that over the past 2 decades, ideological fragmentation and polarization have increased. And that's happened precisely as religious identification has decreased. So there seems to be some kind of correlation there, even if the causal reasons behind it are somewhat unclear. I think one way of looking at it is that if people no longer have traditional religion, they're going to find their sources of meaning and belonging somewhere else. And the somewhere else isn't necessarily better. People can find that in white nativism, ethno-nationalism, Trumpism, or wokeism and its iterations on the left. So it's a sort of be careful what you wish for situation, that we had this kind of secular dream for many decades, that if only religion would fall by the wayside, Americans would become more reasonable, more rational, that we could sort of discuss and debate things in this fact-driven way without resort to superstition and that's superstition and dogma. But as it turns out, dogma can reappear in other guises, and it's not just religion that leads to dogma, but also secularism and liberalism have their own strains of dogmatic reasoning. The political theorist Sam Goldman, who's at GW, has a good way of talking about this. He calls this the law of conservation of religion. And the basic idea behind this is that the supply of religious conviction is constant in American society. What varies is how it's expressed. That's what varies over time. So we have this illusion that we're secularizing, and it is true, we are secularizing, but what's really happening is that religious conviction is being redirected in all of these different ways that are maybe not traditionally religious. So you can think about this in terms of something like yoga or soul cycle. Even think about the name soul cycle. It's right there in the name, that we have these things that essentially are trying to fill the place of religion, but of course they can't quite rise to the occasion because they're not really designed for that. And another way of looking at this is through Ross Douthat has a great quote, which is something to the effect, I'll paraphrase here, that if you didn't like the religious right, wait until you see the post-religious right. And again, something is being redirected here in terms of the energy that we feel in our politics. And what Ross is getting at in this kind of statement is, I think, a powerful one, and I think we can all, or most of us at least, can see it now with Trump 2.0, is that, first of all, we have the most secular president in American history, Donald Trump, someone who is, as far as we can tell, not even necessarily Christian. And I don't say that as a negative thing. He doesn't really take on that label for himself, at least not in a way that is ever convincing. And he oftentimes doesn't even try himself. And so what we have here is a kind of weird mix in the second Trump administration of some Christian right elements, but also what Ross Douthat will refer to as kind of pagan or neo-pagan aspects. that much more blood and soil kind of nationalism, which mixes in with the religion, and it creates something that doesn't really resemble traditional religion in the way that we're used to. And I would say that this is at the heart of why Trump 2.0 is so much more frightening and so much more dangerous, because it doesn't have traditional religion to temper its excesses. And this fits into my broader argument that we should always be careful what we wish for, that less religion in American public life is not necessarily a good thing. And that we need to bring back religious ideas which actually allow for a more ethical and humane approach to politics. And I'll just close and say the last thing I would maybe want to emphasize here is that as far as I see it, there's almost something idolatrous about the Trump administration's approach to politics, or at least how Trump's allies talk about politics. This idea that everything has to be subsumed or subjugated under the great Trump, that Trump is sort of the pinnacle of everything and everything else is secondary. You even see this in the Trump Pope meme, where Trump is sort of mocking Catholicism and is presenting himself as the next Pope, which has even led to some polling outfits actually seeing whether Americans might support Trump as their next Pope. And apparently 12% of American Catholics, according to a recent poll, do support the idea of Donald Trump as their next Pope. But I guess 12% of people can believe in anything, so we shouldn't take that too seriously. But I think what that meme really gets at is a kind of blasphemous approach to politics that has no real place for God. God is not centered in this conversation. Trump is the center of really any and all conversations about the current administration. And that's something that should really give us pause. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Shadi. Christine?
Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you all for having me. Thanks to the Gettysburg Institute. Thank you, Luke, for setting this up. I should state at the outset that I am an American Catholic, and I do not believe that Donald Trump should be our next pope. I want that on record for everyone. But yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating conversation. I think I'll start where Shadi started, actually. The survey that he was pointing to, the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, showed that currently 29% of Americans report themselves to be unaffiliated, whereas 62% identify as Christian and 7% identify as religious but not Christian, so Muslim, Hindu, etc. And this is a pretty sharp decline, down from 78% of Americans who identified as Christian in 2007. But as Shadi mentioned, this number does seem to have plateaued for a while. And I do think that decline in identification may well continue. You know, older people tend to be more religious. They also tend to leave us. Younger people tend to become more religious as they grow older. But right now, 80% of older people identify as Christian, whereas only 46% of the youngest adults do. And that gap may not fill itself in. That said, I was fascinated by, and I love this idea of the rule of conservation of religion, because I think that is just evident in the nuances of what this landscape survey said. So although the number of people who have identified as Christian or indeed religious has declined, it has plateaued, and we actually see more religious impulse remaining than perhaps religious affiliation, which suggests that the faith is still there in some form. It just looks a little bit different. So that same survey that showed this lower amount of affiliation with a particular tribe or religious group still found that 83% of Americans believe in either God or some kind of universal spirit. About 7 and 10% of Americans still believe in some idea of heaven or hell. They might not identify as Christian. They might not identify as any other religion. They might be the famous nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, sort of non-affiliated, but just sort of vaguely spiritual or vaguely something. And I think that that number will grow, if not even decline as people perhaps return. So I'm not sure yet that I have a set political theory of religion, but I wanted to highlight a few sort of interesting and counterintuitive trends that I think that we're seeing in religious affiliation and religious practice in America that will probably have political outcomes, but might not have been expected from the predictions that we hear. So one counterintuitive finding: of the people who are returning to religion, especially in younger generations, right now it seems that young men are actually outpacing young women in returning to the church or the synagogue or the mosque. In the past, it tended to be a clear and assumed trend that women were more religious than men and that it would stay that way. We're seeing a shift now, and we're trying to figure out why. And then when you look at who is returning to religion and what that looks like, we're seeing another counterintuitive trend. Some of the churches and denominations that have become the most popular, the most celebrated by the young, and in fact drawing the most new converts or returnees, are not the more liberal or progressive or closer to secular denominations that you might expect in this secularizing moment, but actually the trad religions. Young people are wearing veils and kneeling at Mass. They're standing in the Orthodox Church. They are not generally becoming Episcopalian. And then one can see that religious aesthetics, which used to be kind of cringe, frankly, are coming back. So, RIP, the late Pope Francis. But the interest in the conclave from people who do not identify as religious in any way is fascinating to me. Is it the aesthetics of the church, the sort of material reality of a faith and liturgy made very visible in contrast to the very immaterial life that many of us are living now? Is there some other attraction to something old in a time when everything seems new and unsettled? Whatever it is, there does seem to be a glimmer of attraction that's happening, especially for younger people, regarding religion. And then finally, we can talk about the classic red-blue divide in religion, where we assume that Republicans, conservatives will be religious, and progressives and liberals will be secular. That still holds somewhat. More than 80% of those who identify as Republican or conservative still identify as Christian. That number is much lower for progressives. But there are splits even between those two camps that we might not have predicted a few years ago. I mean, on the right, think of the sort of Christianity versus tech versions of religion, the Elon versus J.D. Vance religions, if you will. On the progressive side, there are the total secularists, but the new atheists have somewhat fallen out of fashion. Instead, we're seeing progressive readings of traditional tenets. Catholic social teaching is gaining ground. Religious arguments are used to defend progressive policies in a way that seems real. I suspect, personally, that religion will continue to remain and evolve, even as the numbers in identification may shrink slightly. We can see evidence of this spirituality, this religion in public life that might be disguised as something other than religion, kind of everywhere we look. Whether it's the rise of astrology for young people, and young women in particular, whether it's tech fantasies of an AI sort of master race that will change the world, whether it's through nationalism and devoting our religious energy to politics, which, as Shadi grimly pointed out, is very much happening every day. We can see it with our own eyes. And I think part of this sort of conservation of religion will simply be through need. I'm currently working on a project that's in the very early stages about normlessness and enemy, the sort of loss of direction that younger generations especially are feeling. And more, the young people I talk to, and some older people too, note that religion is interesting to them. They may not convert, they may not identify as religious, but it's interesting because it provides an overarching structure to life. There is a glimmer of transcendent meaning there. Even just the idea that someone might think that there is a transcendent meaning that orders one's life is increasingly attractive in a time when so much seems disordered, when people increasingly feel like they are making everything up as they go along. They have to create their lives for themselves. And frankly, I think as our world becomes less social, more distanced, more fragmented, some of the core elements of religion that may not even be spirituality will become more attractive, whether it's meeting with a congregation, having a ritual that one engages with every day, having something to look to other than one's job or politics to give meaning to life. I don't know exactly where this will take us, but I'm optimistic that religion can still provide something positive to our public life. And I think I'll end it there.
Thank you, Christine. So I'm glad that you two teed us up on this way, because this gives us a very good opportunity to do a kind of circle to the left and the right here. Shadi, you mentioned that excellent Ross Douthat quote about the religious right versus the post-religious right. And then Christine, you went and suggested that that one of the ways that we're seeing the rise in traditional religion is not driven by young women, it's driven by young men. There's a highly aesthetic component to it, and aesthetics and spirituality and politics have a very complicated relationship, as you know. And it is a return in the large part, as you said, not to the Episcopalians, but to some of the most traditionalist and you could argue anti-modern denominations in Catholicism and other faiths. But I think most especially Catholicism. I'd be fascinated to see the dynamics and the numbers on how many young men are converting to different Protestant faiths versus to Catholicism in particular. In a lot of my social groups, I've noticed this myself. And I bring this up because I wonder to what degree that what Shadi has been talking about as the post-religious right and that kind of reconversion into highly traditionalist religious groups, specifically by young men who, as we know in America nowadays, there is a young man problem in terms of social enemy, in terms of a sense of loss of place in society and a loss of meaning. To what degree is there like a young male post-religious right, a young male trad religious right? Are those, what's their relationship? I mean, I feel like what you guys both said, you could almost argue that those are the same thing, just taking different external responses to the same enemy. The perception of a highly secularized and leftized and anti-traditional modern society. And so I appreciate you two bringing up both of those sides, because I've never thought about the relationship between those two, but I'm sure you have been observing those separately. And either of you can take that first. I'm just genuinely curious to what degree is a lot of the religious energy on the young male right reactive, genuine, some mix of those two, and how should we be thinking about that now?
That's a great question. I mean, I feel like we, or at least I do not, judge necessarily how much of that is reactive versus sort of legitimate. People convert or say that they're converting for many reasons, most of which remain known only to God. I tend to think that returning to religious tradition version of sort of right-wing young masculinity and the returning to non-religious tradition are kind of two sides of the same coin, as you as you described, they're both in some senses returns to just two different times in tradition. I would say that the religious impulse relates to, an idea of, yes, an older church or an older morality where things have their place, which is attractive. And the return to this kind of pre-Christian reactionary manosphere space is still a return to a time when things had their rules. They might have been the rules of the jungle or the rules of biology. But again, there were still norms. The norm was different. It was whoever is strongest and most ruthless wins. And you sort of showed your valor in different ways, but it was still a ruled space. And I think both of those are attractive. I do think that the traditional Christianity, even the sort of more orthodox forms, still do emphasize a certain level of gentleness, humility, laying down one's life for another, so a lack of selfishness. They do emphasize, in fact, boundaries. And the sort of pre-modern, non-religious sort of return to Nietzschean strength of will does not. It is a much less boundaried space. And so that can be attractive to somebody who, wants to know the norm, but doesn't necessarily need to be, or doesn't want to be bound. So I think there's something going on there, but this is something to think more about.
Yeah, I would add that both currents, in my view, are essentially reactionary. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, just in the sense that they are reacting against something, as you sort of alluded to, Luke, something they see in society, that there has been a very rapid secularization in American public life, and that has destabilized people's sense of self. And then you find different ways of reacting to that and responding to it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But naturally, they'll take on different forms. I think that, and Christine sort of touched on this, that there are things about these two currents, the post-religious right and then the religious right, that are just mutually incompatible. So at some point, I think we're going to see some kind of greater divergence, more internal tensions in the broader right-wing movement over this. Because if religion is fundamentally about submission, and I would say, most religions have a strong submission element. But if you are submitting to God, that's very different than submitting to Trump, similar to what I said earlier. And I think there is a part of the new right that wants to be completely unbound by morality. It's a kind of amoral or post-moral kind of political movement. But ultimately, if you're a Christian, I'm not a Christian, I'm Muslim, but I think it's fair to say for the Abrahamic faiths that we are bound by morality. We are bound by something that can't be defined by human beings or a particular political leader. But I do think that, one interesting thing is if you look at one of the leaders of the non-religious right, Curtis Yarvin, he's an atheist and he's very uncomfortable talking about religion. He doesn't like talking about it much because then he has to show that he doesn't believe in God. And he realizes that might alienate some of his audience. But I think it's interesting that you have a lot of people who are non-religious like Yarvin. They're very careful about how they talk about religion. So they're almost in a sense sublimating or suppressing their atheistic instincts because they realize that they're part of a movement that still has a lot of self-identified Christians. So that dynamic is something else that's interesting to watch. And the last thing I would say is that religion is actually something that you can kind of perform. And I don't necessarily see that as always bad. I mean, one argument is that if you yourself don't believe, you act as if you believe. And then through those acts, your heart can be opened up to God. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's one theory of the case, that you do the ritual, you be in community, you go to church, you go to mosque, and then something will happen to you. So I don't want to say that. I think there is sometimes this sense of insincerity, but you don't always have to be a full believer right at the very beginning. And we've also had a phenomenon of what I've described in my own work as cultural conversions. People who convert to a new religion, not for theological reasons, but for purely cultural or civilizational reasons. And I think one of the prominent cases here is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who converted, she was an atheist, so I guess she converted from atheism and became a Christian. If you look at her initial note explaining her conversion, there's almost nothing about Jesus Christ or the Bible or anything about like Christian teaching. The reason she became a Christian, at least in that initial letter, was because she thought that Christianity was tied to Western civilization, and Western civilization had to be protected against the wokes and against the Muslims. So it was a primarily oppositional kind of posture. She hates certain people, and this is a way for her to affirm an identity that's in opposition to the people she dislikes. In my view, that's not really a traditional reason for converting to Christianity. To take an example on the Muslim side, you have someone like Andrew Tate, who converted to Islam 2 years ago. He's not someone who exemplifies any of the characteristics of being Muslim. And it's hard to say like how there is an argument that it was very performative for him. And if you look at he went on a podcast, he didn't write it down because that's not what he would do. But when he spoke about why he converted to Islam, again, you see this very striking thing. And I actually looked at that first podcast. He actually doesn't mention Prophet Muhammad. He doesn't mention that the Quran is the word of God. These things are completely secondary to him. The reason he converts to Islam, because Islam for him is the badass religion. It's the one that is more masculine, unlike Christianity, which he viewed as feminine and weak and submissive. Again, like so it's just very interesting to look at how people describe those kinds of conversion processes because they say the quiet part out loud.
So I just want to hop in there because I think this is a really interesting trend. And you're not this conversion for like non-spiritual reasons. I think one of the other interesting trends in sort of the return of religion or something like it is the idea of religion as a technology, which is kind of what Shadi is describing here. And you're seeing this, I think, most prominently in tech and founder circles. People like Peter Thiel, who is very Catholic in a space that is very traditionally known to be atheist or rationalist, very questioning. I think you could describe Ayaan Hirsi Ali's conversion and Andrew Tate's to some degree as converting to use religion as a technology. And what I mean by technology is that, they're not converting for the spiritual reasons that they saw God, that they suddenly want to submit, but they're looking at faith, looking at religion, and looking at a specific religion, whether it's Christianity, within that Catholicism, whether it's Islam, as a tool for shaping life. So by becoming religious, by practicing a religion, they are training themselves in some sort of discipline. They're training themselves in forming community. They are able to sort of set up frameworks for their life that then make other parts of their life run more smoothly. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has a better cudgel with which to beat the wokes and the Muslims. Andrew Tate has a new form of inspiration that will help him work out harder and feel better about oppressing women. It's not really about a faith component. It's sort of that practicing a religion, whether you believe or not, is just like a tool for life, like working out or eating a certain diet. And I think that's perhaps one of the most interesting and maybe one of the most important trends that isn't talked about enough in our discussions of religion and public life. The use of religion as a tool, either to signal, either as kind of a lifestyle implement for messaging, but not necessarily for the deep spiritual content. And again, as a believer myself, I'm very interested to see where this goes, because as Shadi points out, there often can be something about, well, I don't believe this, but I'm just going to go. like, I don't believe this, but I'm going to practice something. And then you keep doing it. And there is something about ritual that actually makes things material in a certain way. There is something about being in a milieu that tends to make people become part of that milieu, whether they've actively decided to or not. Certainly, some of these people will adopt religion as a technology and find that it's a technology that's too hard to use, or a technology that's not getting them to their goals fast enough. You see this most often in sort of politicians who convert loudly to Christianity and then realize that it means that they cannot campaign meanly or have many affairs, and they kind of stop talking about it that much. But for other people, it sticks. And I think we're going to discover what it's sticking or it's failing to stick looks like.
I feel like a major public reconversion of Ayaan Hirsi Ali would be fascinating. Like, her path to sainthood would just be a really, really interesting narrative to watch. Or we might also get this, we could start calling this like the Bronze Age Pope Coalition, perhaps, or the Bronze Age Papists or something. So we'll see. But I want to hit back at religion as a kind of social technology and as a tool. And Christina, I appreciate that you mentioned the real fact that sometimes practice is what leads to faith and not the other way around. I think that is something that you see very, very pronounced on, I guess, a lot of the self-help left in a way as well. And it doesn't seem to be in this like boisterous right-wing, in your face, I'm here again, I'm here to be a counterculture, and like true tradition is counterculture. It's not like that. It's like my old mentor, David Brooks, writing to the kind of professional class that he was dissing 30 years ago and telling them, well, actually, there's a lot of true wisdom in what you can learn from Episcopalian Christianity and Judaism. And, you know, you don't have to actually believe it, but go to a couple services and get community and add little rituals into your life. And that can add spiritual meaning to yourself. And a lot of people do it, right? Like a lot of, and you guys have both written at the Atlantic in different times. I get the sense that there's almost like an Atlantean class that doesn't actually believe in any specific faith, but is exactly the kind of people who you guys have been talking about, who just in like a kind of professional upper class left version, who do believe that there's a spirituality out there, but they can't submit their reason. They can't do the submission part.
Yeah.
They can't submit their reason to it, but they will do everything they can, including progressively weirder stuff like SoulCycle, to help themselves, because they are the people who are, in a way, suffering under what the right-wing young men are revolting against, right? So it's interesting because that would seem to be a completely political use of religion. Like if you are ensconced in the present social order and functionally on the center left because you are that, there is a certain approach to religion that you will take and that you will start to follow the Peter Wainers and the David Frenches and folks in that line of religion who emphasize the religion of peace, the religion of a God who is ultimately forgiving and charitable to you and doesn't actually ask you to do very much, right? Whereas if you're opposed to that and are functionally on the further right, then the God or the tradition that you will follow is very much an angry God bringing judgment upon a decadent society. So I guess at some level, what I am just trying to wrap my head around is to what degree is there fundamentally, even quietly, and not necessarily even a partisan way, a fundamentally political underpinning to everything we see as public religion in American life. Like if you take it out of people's direct soul and personal relationship with God, right? Anything above that, to what degree is this inextricable from politics in the broadest sense?
Well, I'd say that it's all political inevitably. I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing myself, because I don't believe in a separation of religion and politics or I don't believe that they are completely discrete categories. Even the fact that we use these terms, religion and politics, and we put them in opposition to each other is a modern construct. If you talk to anyone a couple centuries ago, they wouldn't be able to formulate that distinction. But with modernity, we have this desire and this need to notate and categorize everything and to put things in different boxes. But obviously, life as it's lived is much more complex and confusing, and things get intertwined together. And of course, I think there was also, for much of the 20th century, influenced by Rawlsian thought, this notion that you could keep your religion private. And then what we found out is that it's very hard to keep something that is so vital to you and so important to you private. How do you suppress something that colors every aspect of your being? There was something inherently unreasonable about John Rawls's argument. His argument was basically that for people who are religious, who have comprehensive doctrines, they can have their comprehensive doctrines in a liberal society, but they can't make arguments publicly according to the comprehensive doctrine. They have to always secularize their arguments. They have to make their arguments intelligible to non-believers. So he was putting the onus on religious people to essentially suppress an important part of themselves. He didn't ask secularists or liberals to suppress their liberalism or their secularism. And in my view, all of these things are faith-based. Liberalism is a belief system. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's non-neutral, right? So I think that, yes, that's just one thing to keep in mind here. I would just also just make a note about self-help and how there is a kind of very individualistic component to this religious searching. And that's why, for a while I was listening to happiness podcasts and they sounded like religion. I was really surprised. Sometimes they would be explicit about it and say how we know this from the ancients. And what they were basically talking about is whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Christian traditions, that you can find these things in past faith practices from millennia ago. But what's interesting is how now, like, the search for religion is something that's done, like we're comparing and contrasting religions. We're deciding whether or not we want to convert to something new. It's very much, there's something very modern about it. This idea that you can choose between a menu of options, and then you can choose again and again if you're not completely content with your first choice. So I think that there's no way to kind of go back to a fully traditional or a fully pre-modern approach to religion. These more individualistic ideas are going to be caught up in the whole process, which is why, the religious impulse is redirected in all of these different directions as we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I would say also in the past, you couldn't separate religion from politics because religion was politics, right? Like, you had a monarch. Monarchs were divinely ordained by God. So that was just part of it. You could never pull that out of the way that the state or families or societies function. That was kind of the main thing that they orbited. Some conception of the divine and how the divine worked in life to set up structures or tear them down, to describe the roles of people's lives, whether male or female, serf or leader, or any other sort of distinction that you would make. So I think, with the advent of liberalism, we have tried to separate that out. And I would say that it's almost, when you talk about the sort of like Atlantean, the Atlantean class of quasi-believers, maybe, I think it's almost less a political separation than an actual class separation. So one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot in some sense is the perhaps modern, perhaps liberal, progressive, not in a sort of left, right, red, blue way, but progressive in a I am a modern thinking person versus I am a person who relies on tradition way, which is not always clear on the blue red axis, the way of approaching religion. The sort of like modernist and perhaps more educated class, or wants to appear more educated, or simply just has the sort of time and mental space to do this sort of like judging and weighing and performing enlightenment, kind of feels a bit embarrassed in some ways to state a belief in something that is spiritual, something that can't be proved with data and wonkery, something that you can't quite put your finger on. It's seen as almost a little gauche to say that you like believe in a spirit. Like, who does that? You know, it's 2025. We live in a city, like we know where water comes from. And that sort of the like picking and choosing of like, oh, well, maybe I'll do religion a little bit, not because I believe, obviously, but because I know that it provides community and that's important, is sometimes almost a cover for perhaps being interested in the spiritual, but not wanting to appear backwards in some sense by saying so, or superstitious by believing in something that's seen as old and out of date and unproven or proven against. And yeah, I don't necessarily think that's a red-blue thing. I often think that's a sort of highly intellectualized, sort of like chattering class, knowledge worker class problem. In the same way that, you know, simply making judgments, especially kind of moral judgments, is often just seen as rude. Because one of the key tenets of liberalism and modernism and sort of like getting along to go along in pluralistic society is, you know, not casting judgment on others, not saying that your idea or your belief system is superior to another belief system, which if you have a firm religious belief in one certain God or one certain practice, to say that you do suggests that you think yours is right or better. And for a certain class of people, the class that many people in DC, I think, and in these sort of high income, sort of internationalist cities are part of, it's unmannerly, whether you're on kind of the right or the left. And then on the right, in some ways, adopting a religious posture or a religious pose, it can be a way of just pushing back against sort of this class in general, not even necessarily liberals or progressives, but just that idea of the modern class.
I'll just add, can I just add a kind of example of the gaucheness of religion and this idea? Yeah. So I remember a dinner with close friends a few years ago, and we were talking kind of late into the night and going into more detail about our own religious convictions, or lack thereof in this case. And I remember one of my friends, I was talking about how I believed in an afterlife, and not just heaven, but also hell. And she said something to the effect of, but Shadi, like, you're so smart and intellectual, you don't really believe that hell exists, do you? And I was like, no, I literally believe in hell, and not as some kind of metaphorical thing that hell is just when you're separated from God, which I think is sometimes a cop-out that people use because it just sounds more palatable. But I'm like, I'm actually quite passionate about the existence of hell, and I've written about this and spoken about it.
Those are some of your best pieces.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I want to see this October.
So, and I know I have to say, like, as the world seems to get worse over the past couple of years with the Gaza war and Trump 2.0, I kind of thank God that there's a hell, or at least I think that there's a hell, because I do believe that some people should be punished and some people should spend a significant time in hell. Like, otherwise we don't have justice. And I don't want to live in a world without justice, because I don't think justice is possible in the here and now. We can try, and we should try, but we're not going to achieve it. So then do all the dictators and autocrats and all the people who commit murder, rape, whatever, they'll just get away with it? That is, to me, the kind of logical conclusion of the secular argument. The only way we can have justice for those who have been wronged is by having something that calls all of this into account in the next life.
Now, not to get into a literal theological argument, but just so you know, the Catholic conception of hell is that it's not a significant amount of time. It's you're there forever. If it's just a significant amount of time, that's purgatory. So, and there is a way for the evildoers to go pay their time, do their burn time, and get up. Which, I don't know, I just feel it's interesting. This is about religion in public life. Well, we're like, I guess this is something, the idea of hell across the Muslim and Catholic traditions is something that probably should be somewhere in the public discourse. But I don't know where I would go here unless I went to maybe something with you two at the Institute for Human Ecology, or perhaps the Eisenhower Institute with ICRD. You know,
yeah, I remember Muslims at the Friday sermon when I was young. I remember we used to hear about hell a lot more. Friday sermons over the past 10 years, hell is it's. I'm sure there's a way to like measure this over time. I wish someone did a study of it, but anecdotally, from my own experience, imams don't like talking about hell that much anymore. It goes back to what Christine is talking about. It's part of our religion, but it's seen as it's too rough for the moderns. Like it's rude to talk. Yeah, people. Oh, it's icky. You know.
When you tell someone they're going to hell, like that's mean.
Yeah.
But I mean, not like. Well, if I were to tell someone they were going to hell, that would be mean.
Yeah.
But also, like in a modern society where we're all respecting each other's choices and each other's decisions, to be like your decisions are going to send you to hell is seen as judgmental, and judgmental is sort of the one thing that we're not supposed to be in sort of the liberal and modern society.
Well, and that goes to I think the thing that we've been pushing towards here is religion and the broader moral order, not of the universe, but of society, right? And you two both brought the idea that we live in a liberal pluralistic order where you don't have a final judgment on this by the President of the United States for now on what the religious order of society is. We just all kind of live in a liberal order where everybody has their conscience, everybody has their faith. And even though the trads and the integralists have for 8 years, starting with Patrick Deneen, been attacking that order intellectually, the fact that you have the Bronze Age pervert people and the incredibly like Catholic traditionalist people on the same side of the political dynamic probably means that you're not actually going to, the people who most critique the liberal order are not going to impose a top-down new religious understanding that we all have to live in. But the thing that is just interesting to me is that so much of the debate and so much of the ways that these religious impulses that have been channeled into politics, like you guys said at the beginning, so much of what they are manifesting as is this idea that you can fundamentally transform and reshape the moral order. And again, the integralists are the best example of that, but go to the other side, and a lot of people have made a fairly convincing case that what we all know of as wokeness is something that attempted to fundamentally transform the American civil religion into a justice-oriented and, I guess, equity-oriented, and the suffering shall be morally pure, and those who have oppressed them shall do their burn time here. Like that idea, and Shadi, I know you have a very, very specific relationship to this, so I want to hear your thoughts on it. But if that was a theological or a fundamentally at-root theological thing, and it dominated the political discourse for years, while the kind of MAGA, we're going to make America this either neo-pagan or neo-traditionalist, whatever you prefer, thing again. This feels like not spiritual warfare, but religious warfare, right? This feels like the debate in American society, and at a level even higher than red-blue, at a level of like the fundamental cultural conflicts between something that is deeper than just who gets elected every 4 years, is fundamentally a religious question. And again, like wokeness, MAGA, maybe the two main things on it, maybe this neo-pagan stuff, maybe the David Brooks versus Patrick Deneen stuff. But it all feels to me to be a lot deeper than just electoral horse counting. So I'm wondering if you guys would frame it that way, or if there's something that I'm missing here. And I think the distinctions between you guys' understandings of that would be fascinating to suss out here and over time as well.
Well, I would say that's a really interesting and useful way of capturing that dynamic as religious warfare. Because in the end, when you think about religion, how people conceive of religion, like there are a few components, but what you're trying to figure out is what is holy and worth worshiping, what is good, what does good look like, what is bad, and what does bad look like. And all these things you've described, wokeness versus sort of like traditional religion versus a sort of like pagan or almost non-religious stance, they still have pretty clear positions on what is holy or what is the most worth pursuit in worship, what the good things are in this constellation, what the bad things are, i.e. who deserves to be punished and who is seen as a good person. They're just like different configurations, and they have battled it out over the past decade or two. Whereas I think in decades previous, when there was a more unified sort of sense that like, well, most of us have the same understanding of what good is, what God is, who God is, and who, if not the devil is, what is bad or what is immoral. You didn't really need to duke it out so much. But right, this is what religious warfare has always looked like. Two groups with different conceptions of what the good is, what the holy thing is, and what the bad thing is, clash. And one group's idea triumphs over the other, or it doesn't. So that's a really interesting way of framing that question. And I think as we see what used to be a somewhat more religiously uniform society, even if people didn't necessarily believe personally, or sort of in their hearts have the same approach, it was sort of known and expected that this is what everyone did, and people followed along because it was socially appropriate. As we're sort of leaving that behind, and there are more of these visible differences in religious faith, basically entering the public square, I guess we will expect to see more of these fights, and maybe more and different conceptions of religion will come onto the scene. And so, like, I do think that the sort of like the tech revivalist ideals, the sort of Mark Andreessen, the glory of technology, and like the one man who will like solve things with his mind, and we need to like respect the science, the technological science. Like that is another vision, actually. It's like another religious vision that has like a good, a bad. The good is, the founders and creators. The bad is people, the Luddites who don't like technology. Like that's going to have to fight with the visions of the good and the bad that exist in the public square. I think we're just going to see that multiply.
Yeah. So I think that if you kind of take a historical approach, you can kind of look at the Cold War period as kind of exceptional because we had a common enemy, and therefore that allowed the differences between the two parties to be somewhat narrower than they would otherwise have been. And then there was the kind of triumphalism of the post-Cold War period that lasted not too long, as it turns out, maybe 10 years or so. And then you have, I think, the beginning of a fundamentally new era, which is slowly ushered in by 9/11, but then I think really comes into its own in the mid-2010s. And
what did 9/11 do to cause that?
It punctured the triumphalism. Okay. We could no longer, the cracks were beginning to show. We couldn't have this kind of straightforward, linear, optimistic view of history. That history was coming back, if you will. And so I think that the mid-2010s, we see the rise of what I've called existential politics, where it's no longer about policy differences, tax rates, healthcare. It's about the foundational questions of who are we, what makes a nation, what does it mean to be American, and what is the role of religion in public life. And those are the things that are much more difficult to resolve peacefully or productively, because they really arouse our deepest sense of what's right, just, and good. And unfortunately, we don't agree, as Christine said, on what is right, just, and good. We no longer have that common reference point where we can say, okay, here's what the common good is. There is no such thing as the common good anymore. I think that religion, in my sort of ideal world, religion as I see it, maybe not as it's necessarily practiced, should be able to allow us to chill more in politics, because what religion does, it shifts the horizon, it shifts the battleground. It's no longer about everything has to be resolved in the here and now. You can actually, this goes back to what I said about hell, because judgment is God's alone, ultimate judgment is God's alone, and because it happens in a different world, in a different life, that we can say, look, we try our best in this world, but we might not get what we want. At least we have something more than politics, which is God and our religious tradition. And therefore we can let go and relax. Not everything has to be dealt with now. God will deal with it later. And I think this idea of delayed or postponed judgment, it's at the heart of strains of Christianity and Islam and Judaism. It's always been there. Sometimes it's been obscured and people don't always emphasize that. And I would say that if you look at a lot of evangelicals today, they're not necessarily acting in that chill manner. They're not necessarily adhering to delayed judgment, but I think it's there in our religious traditions, and we have to rediscover it. And there's something liberating about it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we didn't have to obsess about politics so much, and we could just say, look, politics matters, but it's not the be all end all, and there's something beyond politics. The fact that it's so hard for people to actually do that and act like they believe that means that we've theologized the political. That's what we have to fight against. And if I had like one message for people, it would be take very conscious action to de-theologize the political. Otherwise, politics becomes a holy war. And this is where you hear language which makes it sound like a holy war. When people say this is the most important election of our lifetimes, but they say that every single election. So that obviously doesn't make any sense. Not every election can be the most important election of your lifetime. Only one can be that, right?
Well, but the next one is.
Yeah, the next is always the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something very stressful about living in an imminent frame, especially like in our current imminent frame, which is just like every day is extremely stressful when you're thinking about our political landscape, our climate, like everything that's happening in the world. But living in a non-imminent frame and like having that sort of chill. I mean, this is why, Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, right? If you are able to sort of take a step back and be like, I might not solve this today, God will resolve it, you're chill. That means you might not do things.
It's not good for utopian movements.
Yeah, that might mean that you don't take as intense an action in your day-to-day life as you might. And in some sense, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that can be a risk. But I think I agree with you that the risk of theologizing the wrong thing, the risk of starting a holy war over something that doesn't actually matter, is maybe greater.
I don't think that this is the time to explore this one yet, but I want to put a pin in this particular question, because at some level, a lot of this conversation is making me wonder to what degree is this like a messianic holy war a unique thing to America and modernity, and something that's brought about by secular modernity, or to what degree is America more uniquely susceptible to this than other countries are because of the ways the American religious landscape has been since the 1600s. I mean, to the point about utopianism, there's an obvious counterargument, which is that from about the 1830s through like the 1910s and 1920s, there was this brand of really kind of wacko utopian Whigs to mugwumps to progressives, largely in the Republican Party at that time, that was super, super socially reformist. And these people believed in moral perfection. And they were the ones who set up all the anti-slavery societies and the temperance societies. And then in the late 1890s, they set up the Boy Scouts and the Rotaries and Alcoholics Anonymous and all these groups that have played a fundamentally secular, but still kind of like spiritually utopian place. And then also on the flip side of that, as you're noting, they were as vitriolically insane in politics as the slaveholders and the populists and the plutocrats who had their own sorts of like counter ideologies to them. So in the American hearth, it just is a fascinating question. And I think you're right that we have something distinctly new in modernity. And I hope somebody eventually writes a history of this kind of stuff from the 50s or 60s to the present to kind of suss out some of this. But I have one last question for you guys as we move on. And I want everybody to know that we are now open to audience Q&A. So if you have questions, please start to raise your hands and we will try to get more voices into this conversation. I know there's some very deep thinkers in this audience. I'd be curious how you think about these things too. But the last thing I have is I wonder what you guys think about the role or about just the idea of providence in all this. There's that old quip, there is a special providence for fools, drunks in the United States of America. And the argument for those who haven't heard that quote being that like America should not have survived, right? America is a nation with the soul of a church, but the thing about being a nation with the soul of a church is that it gets into these crazy revivalist stuff. And yet somehow it did. It survived the Civil War. It survived everything industrialization that broke other countries. And that it's almost as if like in an Old Testament sense, America survived despite itself. Everything that we're worried about tearing this country apart, whatever the proto versions of it survived. And I guess at some level, one of the deepest things that any religious believer can get to entirely outside of public life, and maybe Andrew Tate and Ayaan Hirsi Ali will get here eventually. Perhaps they will. Perhaps they're already there and they just can't be public about it. Is a total spiritual acceptance, right? And resignation to fate. This is what you were starting to get at, Christine, about the notion that this takes things outside of politics and moves them. Shadi, this is the chill that you talked about. To what degree is that either a functional thing that that can change the approach of Americans to religion or politics, and also to what degree is that something that, in order to genuinely like have a religious approach to public life, the functional prospect of peace or better politics isn't the point. It's the submission to the idea that there is a force higher than yourself directing the fate of you and all your countrymen in America, which, as you know, is like not something that you would see often. But Donald Trump himself said something like that shortly after he was almost assassinated in August of 2024, which is crazy when you think about it. You know, so I'm just wondering what you guys think about providence.
Yeah, but both of those things can be true at the same time. You can make religion for you can be primarily about submission. But you can also have the belief that if enough people are religious in the better way, that will have a kind of cumulative effect on society and on politics and will make our politics better. But I would see that more as a byproduct of being religious, not necessarily the goal of being religious. And I'm someone who believes, I think that Islam is, going back to what Christine said, we're not supposed to say that we think religions are superior, but by definition, I'm Muslim because I think Islam is better than the available options and the best of the available options. That said, I would like to see more Christianity in American public life. And you can believe that about Christianity, even if you don't believe it's true. I don't believe in the Trinity. I don't believe in Christ as Lord and so forth. But I think that it's good for people to believe that if the if it's between believing in Christianity and being non-religious, I would much prefer people to be Christian in American public life. So I'm someone who believes that there will be these effects, these byproducts that are positive for all of us if more people move in that direction. So that's I don't think there's going to be another religious awakening, at least not in the way that we've had religious awakenings before. But if we have an uptick that's sustainable, where we have church attendance going above 50% and maybe going towards 60% in the coming 20 to 30 years, that would be lovely to see. And I think it would have really, in ways that we can't even fully anticipate, it will help our political life. It'll bring some stabilization, some balance back to our political life. So that's kind of how I would see it, is that that's not what we strive for. It's not what we expect, but it's possible that will be a byproduct if more people move in that direction.
So I feel like that's a perfect example actually of the Christianity as a technology.
Yeah, right.
We were talking about earlier, like, I'm not Christian, I don't believe in it, but if people acted more Christian, that would just be better.
Which John Roush wrote a whole book about recently.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I talked to him about that at Brookings when the book came out.
That was a great event. I'm glad you did it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I'm grateful that I went.
The question of providence. First of all, who is that quote from?
There's a special providence for
Yeah.
fools. Okay. I think this is one of those quotes that just shows up on the internet as being by everybody else. I think Walter Russell Mead.
He wrote a book about it.
Yes, he did. It was a great book
called Special Providence.
Okay.
which is actually not really about that quote, and it should be, but there's that. Mead attributes it to Otto von Bismarck, and I think it's important that he attributes it to somebody who's in a very reactionary European country who kind of has disdain for the United States. But he's the one who typically attributed. I've heard somebody say it was Tocqueville too. I don't know. We could also say Abraham Lincoln said
it doesn't really sound like something Tocqueville, but sure.
You could also attribute it to me. I'd be very honored.
Noted. I love the idea of providence. It is what I would wish for and what I hope for as a religious person. I'm just like now kind of close, putting on my sort of like English class hat and like close reading this quote. In some ways, this is also an example of the imminent frame that I would kind of hope to leave. So fools, drunks in the USA. I mean, a fool is a person, an individual person. Similarly, a drunk is an individual person. If we believe that, God creates and loves individuals. The USA is not a person. It's not really a thing. It's an idea that like some of us cherish, but it is also a very imminent place. It's not that old. It's just like a nation. And I would love for there to be providence that includes the United States. We do seem to get out of scrapes, or like so far. I don't know how optimistic I feel for the future. But I would wonder if this sort of like religious providence that we're hoping for in regard to these two individuals should apply to the concept of the United States. I'm wondering if this framing like actually elevates the idea of the United States, or the United States as a place, or some individual conception to a sort of moral plane that it doesn't deserve. Like, do we pray for the nation, the concept of the United States of America, or do we pray for our fellow citizens? Do we pray for our neighbors, our family, the people involved? I often think, actually, with quotes like this, the debate that we're having now, right, where in certain senses, the concept of the United States or America as a Christian nation or a sacred nation is actually being weaponized in what I think are actually irreligious and perhaps even heretical ways to justify, some truly terrible policies. Well, America is a Christian state, and we have to keep all of our money for ourselves. So those babies with AIDS in Africa can just starve to death or, die. America is a Christian nation that must be preserved, and therefore we must be incredibly cruel to migrants because they're doing something to America that's sacred. And in some ways, and this is also, if not a class more, like a political more, it feels almost dangerous for me to be like, I like America, but I care more about these individuals, frankly, than just like the idea of the state. I care more about providence, justice, mercy for that individual, that fool, that drunkard, that migrant, than I do for just like the concept of America to extend itself for 200 more years. So I would hope for providence. And again, like I attempt, often unsuccessfully these days, to live in a non-imminent frame and like worry less about the continued excellence of America and think more in the long term. But it's difficult.
Also, please raise your hands if you have questions too, so we can get to others. But
I guess, on the providence thing, I think America is remarkably successful, not because it's America, but because it's a democracy and it has certain ideals. So if we gave up on those ideals, then I think we would no longer be subject to that providence. That's why I find the Trump era so frightening, because it undoes the very things that has allowed America to get through the scrapes and to muddle through. We've had, every generation has a literature around decline. That's like the one constant about American public life, is people talking about the decline of America. But I do think that, why is democracy better? Longer story, but the short version is it's better aligned with human nature and how God intended us to be. That authoritarianism and dictatorship is against what God wishes, because it's idolatrous. It puts the individual, it puts the dictator and the state above God. And that is a great affront to God, if not the greatest affront to God. And in Islam, elevating human things to God's level is the greatest sin. It's called shirk, or idolatry. So, I do worry that that's where we are, that's where we're going in the current moment, that we're moving towards an idolatrous politics that will remove God's favor from us.
In which case, like, America has ceased to be America.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Let's go to a question first from the gentleman in the back. What's your name, sir?
Yeah, my question is, if you read about Talmud, I don't know how to Jewish book, Talmud versus Quran, they are not very different. Whatever Talmud has said about Jesus, for example, that he is burning in hell, and his mother Mary knows this, these kind of things. Quran says the same thing about Judaism or Jewish people. So my question is, how come people don't pay much attention to Talmud, but they pay a lot of attention to Quran, but brutal or cruel thing it has said about opposition or against Jewish or against some other groups.
The Quran doesn't say that Jews are going to hell. Actually,
Talmud said that.
That Jews are going to?
No, Jesus is burning in hell.
But Jesus didn't exist when the Talmud was written.
No, it was. I mean, it said that. I maybe if Facebook,
No, but I guess your general point is that. What are you getting at with these examples?
There are so much against Islam, but nothing about. I mean, Islam is kind of copy paste of these books, Old Testament especially.
I mean, as a Muslim, I don't believe it's a copy paste of the Old Testament. I believe it's divine revelation.
Okay.
I mean, by definition, that's what makes me Muslim, right?
Right.
To be Muslim means that you believe the Quran is the word of God.
Right. Okay. So, and second thing, do you know if MBS was raised by a Jewish mother?
Sir. This is something that would be very important for an interfaith conversation, and I think we probably will do stuff like that. I'm not saying that the content of particular faiths is immaterial to public life, but at some level, I think this conversation has gone in a different direction than that. If you want to talk about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity and Islam in the current moment, I think that would be a fascinating thing to discuss. But actually, Shadi, I mean, a little bit further on this, our friend Ibrahim Anli has been actually talking about like a much more deep relationship between Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and the idea that there's not just a Judeo-Christian tradition in America and the West, but there's a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition across the whole Mediterranean world. Does that have any legs, and does that matter for America?
I think it has legs. I think we do often talk about the Abrahamic traditions as a group of three. I don't think that Republicans in this country talk about it as a group of three, and they never want to include Islam in there. I find that to be a little bit dispiriting. But I do think there is a strong undercurrent, or maybe just a current of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab animus in the Republican Party that I think drives a lot of this. And according to most of the polling we have on this, white evangelicals almost always come out as the single most anti-Muslim demographic in America. I mean, why that's the case is a longer story. I do think some Christians, especially evangelicals, and struggle to see Islam as on a positive level, because for them Islam came after Christianity. It's always hard when the sequencing is in that direction. I think it's easier for us as Muslims to look positively at Christians and Jews because we sort of see ourselves as completing prophecy and in some ways building on what had come before. And we do consider Jesus to be a prophet, Abraham as a prophet, and so on. It is, I think, sometimes harder for Christians to elevate Islam to an honored level. And similar to how I think Christians struggle with Mormonism and seeing Mormons as being even Christian in the first place. So I think the sequencing issue is one that doesn't always get talked about as much. But I think that when you're talking about doing interfaith or multi-faith discussions, it's really important to be straight up about those differences and not do the whole kumbaya. We're all basically the same. We're not the same. We are different. But we have to find a way to talk about difference in a way that's productive and not kind of sweep those differences under the rug.
I do think that one of the interesting things that I've seen happening a little more often in this political moment, if only for coalitional reasons, is, and perhaps because of the sort of like the shared roots, the shared roots of the Abrahamic tradition lends to sometimes at least sort of similar moral ideas or moral norms or practices that conservative Christians sometimes decide to reach out and kind of like adopt conservative Muslims into their camp a little bit, because it's sort of like, oh, we are both conservative about these social mores or this understanding of gender, so we can like kind of be on the same team a little bit when it comes to certain debates.
Yeah, there was that brief alliance on gender and sexual identity and trans issues. I think a lot of that went by the wayside after October 7th, where I think that the fact that so many right-wing Christians are very hardline supporting Israel and what it's doing in Gaza, it sort of made that alliance, I think, untenable. But for a moment, it really did seem like something was building around the gender issues. But I feel like as that stuff subsides, and I think it's no longer the primary issue and hasn't been for some time, you no longer have that uniting issue that brings them both together.
Yeah, and I think that many Americans and American Christians, I think introduction to Islam or Islamic culture still feels like it was 9/11.
Yeah, problem.
Which is just like associates Islam with animus.
Yeah.
Like independent of whatever Islam contains. And that has just been like the starting point of the relationship between the two sort of areas of faith.
It opens up the fascinating concept, though, that goes against what a lot of what we've talked about here. The idea that so we've premised a lot of this conversation on the idea that increasing systemic quasi-religious warfare in politics is a bad thing, but increasing quasi-systemic religious warfare that brings conservative Christians, conservative Muslims, conservative Jews, conservative Hindus, presumably conservative other faiths, an alliance against secular modernity, and also the kind of the modernizing and theologically less traditional components of an already existing interfaith tradition with secular nuns too, already has created a kind of deep interfaith unity there too. And so like you can see a world where the polarization and conflict on political grounds using religion actually opens up the possibility, as you two have both suggested with the Islamic and evangelical case, of bringing a kind of religious dialogue together through politics, at which point the question is like, do the conservative and liberal wings of each religious group still have enough in common together that politics doesn't break them the way it's broken the Baptists and the Catholics at different points of life?
Yeah.
Which is fundamentally, I mean, like, we do have a very useful thing in America to model that off of, which is Federalist Number 10 and the party system. But that is another question entirely, so we'll go there.
I do think if secularism becomes too strong, as it I think has in recent years and decades, I think that it's positive for people of faith from different traditions to kind of come together and say, secularism, okay, we're going to have to fight back a little bit and push back because there is excess. And I think that's a kind of natural sort of pendulum effect, and that can be constructive as long as it doesn't go overboard.
Mike.
Do you think of Marxism as a religion? I know that well, at least once Michael Lind argued on that was with its vision of good and evil, it's of an ultimate judgment day at the end, and that it's hymns and it's sacred texts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you guys thought on that? This
Yeah,
is
I
something
guess
that there were a lot of folks in the
Yeah.
50s and 60s thinking on some too. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is a faith-based ideology. It does require a kind of belief in a prophet, Marx, and it requires a belief in a manifesto and other books of that nature.
As sacred texts, yeah.
Sacred texts, yeah.
That multiple sects go and argue about for decades.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes kill each other over. Yeah.
And I guess it has a sense of that. Is there something I think that it's not a religion in the sense that it doesn't have an account of the transcendent, and we have to be careful about calling. We can say that ideologies have resemblances to faith and religion, but to say that they're exactly the same as religion, I think, is a mistake. That's why wokeism mimics religion, but it's not the same as a religion.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think I put wokeism in maybe a similar category as Marxism, a strong faith-based ideology that has sacred texts, and I don't know exactly what they are, probably some CRT stuff, but I can't remember who the authors are. But
Angela Davis.
but I guess it has also Ibram Kendi. Yeah, I guess it has more like modern pop sacred texts that are accessible to more people, from Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, those books that were popular and everyone was reading for a while. So I think that the religion comparison is useful, but we have to be careful not to. I think sometimes people will use the religion comparison to basically say, oh, they're just like religions, almost as if that's a bad thing. When I would actually like them to be more like religions, because religions have forgiveness, they have grace. And I don't think that these ideologies are really known for their forgiveness and their grace. They're very punishing in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting framing, because you're right. Like, they also, like religions, have their vision of the good and the bad.
You could even argue that Marxism has a more literal version of providence than most other religions too.
Yeah, there's often a godlike figure, there are prophets. But the thing about ideologies, especially like these political ideologies, is that they're in the imminent frame, right? Like, judgment is happening like right now. We're in it. It's not like once you die, you're out of the game, basically. And I think that is the thing that both makes them more likely to kind of burn out on some level. Because if there's no transcendent thing, if there's no like sort of overarching good that you're looking for, like, eventually it's tiresome and it's over. Like, there's nothing else going on. And also things that exist only on an imminent frame force action now. And forced action now doesn't even sound good, right? Like, that sounds like violence, which is often where these things end up, either literal or figurative violence, because you have to take care of the problem yourself in this moment. There's like actually not very much room for providence is the problem. There is no one else who's going to help you solve the problem. There's no order to the problem other than the order that you force upon it yourself, which can be a harsh and alarming sort of way to move through the world. I think in contrast to religions that have a longer sort of time frame and like vision of the good or the transcendent. And it's that longer vision that allows time for things like forgiveness and mercy and grace to be worked out. If you have to accomplish the goal, the project, the ideology, like within your lifetime, who has time to like work through like a cycle of forgiveness and sin and grace with someone? Like, you cut them out, and because you have to keep moving, and that makes, I think, some of these practices a lot harsher, or feel a lot harsher.
It's interesting because you guys are both right about this, and this just dawned on me. When people say wokeness is a religion, MAGA is a cult, not to this Terra, but Soul Cycle is weird, and people look at it too religiously. That does, in fact, look at these things from fundamentally a secular liberal pose. I mean, Terra is like much more charitable about this, but like calling things religions in a bad sense is fundamentally like looking at it from an Enlightenment rationalist view, where religion itself is kind of irrational, which might have some sense of the staying power of the liberal order in some sense too. But I appreciate the distinction that you guys are making between ideologies and religions, because most people don't. And that actually probably could be a really good leavening for the public discourse. That may help wokeness and MAGA to actually become more forgiving and charitable and integrative. So, Ray.
And I really appreciate Mike's question, because one of the things I was trying to clock you guys on was whether you guys are talking about religion from a purely functionalist lens or a substantive lens. And the entire time, you guys are dancing between both. You guys are making functionalist critiques, but also functionalist observations, substantive critiques, but also substantive observations. And I think and the whole point about technology also is that, like, increasingly you see religious actors trying to make functionalist arguments for why their religion is good, why it's good for society, why we need it more. I even found myself doing that in the line of work that we do, whether it's, preventing violent extremism, but also rebuilding social trust. I'm a firm believer that houses of worship in the US are integral parts of our social fabric, and that we should preserve them as much as possible, because they bring people from diverse backgrounds together. That's a functionalist definition and argument for why religion is good. But I'm wondering, kind of like back to Shadi's point about like, we should make conversations about hell more common or something, but like, what would a substantive pro argument for religion be? Because the functionalist part's easy, because then even Enlightenment secularist folks can get behind, as long as you make a good case for like, I see the utilitarian value of religion. But what happens after that's achieved? Will religion continue to be of value? What is the substantive part?
The substantive case, I think, is simple. It's true.
Okay.
Yes, it's true. And if it's true, then that means that, that you should believe in it. But also that I think that on an individual level, I think the argument would be what's likely to happen after we die, and people want to have some account of death that is compelling. And if there is an afterlife, presumably we would want to allow ourselves a better chance to be in good stead after we die. So that kind of gets us into the whole Pascal's wager argument, that even if you're not 100% sure about God, you're better off believing in God, because, you know, if you're going to face him in judgment and he's going to say, well, I mean, I made all my signs apparent to you, and I was like, I did the sun, I did the clouds, I did the rain, I did everything, and you still didn't believe in me. Like, that's going to put you in a bit of an uncomfortable situation. Doesn't mean you're necessarily, I mean, not necessarily, but it's just going to lead to a little bit of an awkward conversation with God. You're probably better off trying to at least be like, well, at the very least, I wasn't 100% sure which of the faiths was the right one, but at least I believed in you, God. At least I prayed to you. This is similar to the argument that Raz Douthat makes in his new book, which I think is excellent, which is called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And in the final chapter, he does come around to saying that he thinks that Christianity is the best option out of the available options, but for the whole rest of the book, he's actually very ecumenical, saying, you know, different faith traditions are worth exploring, and it will be different for each person. And that's kind of how I feel about it. I don't need everyone to be Muslim. If people end up being Muslim, great. But if people find God through other means, then I think that's better than not believing in God at all. Not to sound like a total relativist here, but so I think that would be the substantive argument, that if God exists, if God is true, then it's better for people to believe in him.
But is that substantive, or is that also like a functional argument?
Yeah, like hedge your bets, you know.
The function is like avoiding an awkward conversation, which is like the most millennial reason to do anything.
I'm also glad that is now on the record. Somewhat awkward conversation.
Yeah,
We should make
yeah.
I don't
You
buy
don't want to be
for sure,
embarrassed.
millennials.
Yeah.
I fell into functionalism. You make a good point. Yeah,
Because it's like, I think that maybe it's because we're stuck in this hyper immanent frame.
Yeah.
Where we've blown up this transcendent, or we've essentially immanentized the transcendent, because we are the ultimate transcendent, the human being post-enlightenment. We are the highest thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, like the substantive case for religion, it does involve being like, oh, God is real, or like whatever spirit, numinous being, like transcendent experience that you're having means something. And to get there, like kind of just it fundamentally, and this is like the awkward thing to talk about in the modern age, because again, we're materialists, we're scientists, like we want to like, oh, you say that the Eucharist is being transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. Well, let me look at it under a microscope and see if there are blood particles here. Like we need to see the evidence. But to get to this, to make the claim like God is real, is an act of faith. Like at the end of the day, it just has to be an act of faith. That's kind of the whole, and that's like the tricky thing, and the thing that makes it sort of like hard to recommend, and I think hard for sort of like the enlightened modern to deal with, because we're very unused to it. In fact, we have sort of downplayed or tried to diminish the idea of like some things are just a mystery. Like
but Christine, you don't think
it's not knowable.
Isn't it possible to will ourselves to believe at some level that can't we just be like, I'm deciding that God is real. I herefore decide that God is real, and then things flow from that decision.
Yeah, exactly.
That's-
But like, but to make that choice, like, it's not. I don't know. Like, I guess it's like you could say that you're making like an evidence-based choice, which is kind of what you were describing with this wager, like based on like all the clouds in the sun, like the things that are here, like on balance, it seems like probably God is real because like so much is going on. But
I feel like it's
still
also possible to whimsically though too.
Yeah, but there's like still a little bit of a leap there, right? You're still saying like based on this, I'm taking this next step that like there's still like a little space. It feels sort of between those two things, and that's like the hardest thing to sort of like explain or choose, and that's like the substance of faith, right? Is having faith. However you get there.
Tracy, did I see your hand raised a few minutes ago? No. Okay, do we have, oh, yes, Sabrina, I was hoping you would ask something.
Yeah, thank you both again for coming. I was thinking about Gavin Ortland from Fuller, who I'm a big fan of his within the Christian world because he tries to promote unity, and like truthful discussion between the denominations. But he wrote this book on how evangelicals can see that their past actually includes theology and history. I think he's trying to prevent like some of these the conversions that we started the conversation with, especially to like Catholic and maybe Reform and traditional movements. But yeah, I grew up pretty evangelical, and a lot of that is like taking pride in fundamental beliefs and what that community looks like. But I'm just wondering what you both see around the world. I'm thinking especially in the Islamic world, where we have like these interfaith coalitions or politicians, or like what we're seeing in Syria. And some communities might pride themselves in that, and some might like become more fundamentalists. And I think we're seeing that in the US to an extent. But yeah, do you think that's a global trend or just in the Trump 2.0 era?
Is it a trend? I think there's a self-selection issue, and we see this in interfaith spaces where in interfaith dialogues, the people who often go are the ones who are more likely to be ecumenical and liberal in their orientation, when the people you really want to be getting to these kinds of dialogues are the conservatives or the hardline ones, really. And this is why I think interfaith efforts often kind of hit a limit really quickly. There's just like the whole trope of bringing imams and pastors and rabbis together to condemn extremism. But like that condemnation of extremism is not going to be very effective to the audience they're trying to seek out, because those are the ones who are going to be seen as like more fluffy and accommodating. You want the Salafis to be making those condemnations of extremism. You want the hardline like white evangelicals to be speaking out against Trump, but those are precisely the kinds of people who don't often speak out, so you get stuck in this kind of cycle. And I think that's been a real, and you see how it affects like the evangelical community, where you have someone like Russell Moore who's speaking out very passionately and eloquently against Trump, but he's seen a certain way, and he's not seen as a legitimate voice because he's now seen as soft, and he's not the real deal or whatever. And that's always going to be a challenge, and sometimes you can't really get past it. But there is this kind of risk of audience capture. I think this has happened to David French as well. He's lost his credibility with evangelicals because he's become like, in a sense, too liberal or not conservative enough. So I would maybe like to see some of these voices try to maintain their kind of harder edges, because it's their very harder edges that give them credibility with the very people who need to hear their message.
And to go to the reverse side of that dynamic that you just talked about, there's a lot of folks who are in the New Atheists who have not necessarily converted, but have spoken out really, really loudly against the left. and have become functionally right-wing in ways that have pushed a lot of the kind of secular left that is still like anti-further left fundamentally rightward. A lot of the people in the IDW, Richard Dawkins was the strangest kind of version of this, which maybe doesn't have maybe it doesn't speak very well of human nature, but it does say a lot of things about the religious coalitions that happen too. So I just have one last question for you guys before we get out of here, and to go back to the original purpose of this conversation, which, by the way, this is opening a lot of questions for me, and I appreciate you guys helping me think through these things. And what should somebody who is not an expert, not necessarily an activist or practitioner, but somebody who is hoping to make a good difference in American public life and sees religion as an integral part of that, not necessarily in making everybody more religious, but sees understanding religion in American culture, politics, and public life in general as important for their goals, whether it's analysis, whether it's teaching, whether it's activism, whether it's politics, whatever. What do you think they should know that they might not know going into it, either from this conversation or just from the outside part of it?
It's hard to say what they might not know, because that's actually such a broad audience of people, but I would say what they should do, perhaps, is seek to understand religion, first of all. I think there are so many people, journalists especially, but also academics, people in the public square who talk about religion or have thoughts on religion, but actually don't know anything about religion, who have thoughts on how Christians should behave in the public square or what the underlying philosophy of Islam is or whatever, but have not actually cracked open a Bible and read anything there, or actually don't know how what Islam is and how it operates, and so often have sort of kind of weird conceptions of what religion is supposed to do or how it works or how Christians or Jews or something should act that are totally untethered from what the religion is. So just familiarizing oneself with sort of what the religion is and what the core is, I think is key. Shadi and I are both members of Faith Angle Forum, which is an organization at the Aspen Institute actually that sort of exists basically to educate journalists about faith and what it looks like and how to sort of better report on faith in the public square by having a passing understanding of what it is. And I think more people could stand to do that, especially if they want to make religion in the public square fruitful and useful and have useful dialogues. The other thing I think, and I think we talked about this kind of a lot at the beginning of throughout our conversation really, is to sort of resist or push back on the idea that faith or religion is backwards, or something that like this sort of oh, you don't really still believe in hell, like a stupid person. That sort of reflexive understanding of religion as something that fundamentally doesn't make sense or is fundamentally anti-modern or cannot in fact coexist with intelligence in other spheres. I think that's just, especially in often political circles and high-minded circles, one of the sort of few remaining biases that's acceptable, being well, people who believe in the spiritual are kind of stupid. And sort of just pushing back against that, even in conversation, I think helps make just conversations about religion more allowable, grows the space for religion in public life.
Yeah, I would say that one thing for the Atlantic or Atlantean class that would be helpful is to engage in a certain amount of self-awareness, self-criticism, where they see themselves as rationalists, they only follow the truth or facts or evidence, but that everyone inevitably is making leaps of faith in their own particular way. We all have dogmas. We all have things that we don't want to question. That's the whole point of ideology. And we're all ideological at some level. There's no one who is completely neutral and objective. So checking yourself and seeing where your own dogmas are coming out of. So even something like during the COVID era, where follow the science became a dogma, and a way to kind of use a cudgel to be used against people to kind of silence them into submission and to not question official narratives. That was, I think, in some ways like a dark period in how far we went with some of that. That was a faith-based kind of way of looking at the world, to kind of elevate scientists, but not even scientists, just some scientists, as the priesthood that we cannot question. We all do that in our own ways, and we just have to be self-aware about it.
Well, I hope all of you came out of this with a little bit of a better roadmap of American religious life. I certainly have, and I've come out of this with a few more questions than answers, but I hope that at some point I hope this conversation has at the very least helped me to avoid that awkward conversation with God that we millennials are all probably doomed towards. With that, you can hear more of this kind of conversation on many, many kinds of topics if you go subscribe to a very, very wonderful newsletter here in DC, The Wisdom of Crowds, and listen to Shadi's and Christine's and all of their colleagues' banterings on many, many different subjects informed by deep philosophical history and political understandings. I am a fan particularly of the essays they publish out there, but beyond that, their podcast is great. So make sure to take a look at Wisdom of Crowds. Make sure to take a look at Shadi's and Christine's work. Christine, do you have a Substack?
I do.
Okay.
It's a little bit dormant, but we're starting up again.
We will look forward to that as well. Christine and Shadi both have Substacks. You can find them if you just look up Christine Emba Substack and Shadi Hamid Substack. Definitely follow those. Those are worth following, and their work in general is good. I will be excited for the books that they have coming out pretty shortly as well. And in the meantime, I would also encourage everybody to follow the Eisenhower Institute's newsletter, because they run events with various organizations and various interesting people quite frequently here in DC and also in Gettysburg. And they're also just a really good institution that, again, hits a niche that not a lot of people in American public life hit. And there are people who, I think, if you follow them a little bit more closely over the coming years, you'll see good things coming out of their work that all of us can learn from. Lastly, we at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy are going to be holding an event on May 28th in partnership with our friends at the Institute for Religion and Democracy. ICRD and IRD are two different institutions, I assure you, but we're friends. We do good things. And our other friends over at the Rumi Forum, who does more interfaith stuff, with the conservative author Carrie Sheffield on her memoir of family reconciliation and religious life, The Motorhome Prophecies. You should be seeing registration information for that coming out in a couple of days now, so we will hope to see you on May 28th over at IRD. In the meantime, Ray, should I hand this off to you, or are we good to end from here?
You can wrap it up.
Great, cool. Well, everybody, I have enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to many more. And just know that Washington, D.C. has some good forms of public discourse. I think in the long term, it can deserve a much better form of public discourse in many more places than there is right now. And I look forward to working with Shadi and Christine and others in our friend groups here to help bring that to the American people as these times get stranger and stranger and stranger, and yet more providentially hopeful too. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night and have a good night.
Thanks for doing it.
Hey, thanks for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, you're